Hello and welcome to the latest interview in the Truth According to series. Today in the studio I'm joined by Professor William Shabas from Middlesex University. He's a Professor of International Law and today he's going to be talking about capital punishment. So Professor, thank you very much for joining us in the studio today. So let's start by telling me and the viewers a little bit about you.
Well, I'm originally from Canada. I've lived in Ireland for a dozen years and now in the United Kingdom for the last 3 years. I'm an academic, essentially trained as a lawyer, and I practiced law for some years, but I'm essentially now university-based, and I teach and supervise doctoral students, and I write books, including a lot about capital punishment. I've been working on the subject of capital punishment, mainly capital punishment related to international law, for almost a quarter of a century now.
So, in a nutshell, what is capital punishment for those less informed?
Well, we're talking about something that is conducted under the laws of a country. So it's distinct from a phenomenon that we see in some countries, which we call summary execution or extrajudicial execution. That's when there are hit squads, vigilantes, and so on, killing people. This is about legally imposed punishment that involves executing someone, bringing an end to their life. It's been around historically for forever, more or less, and we have many famous examples of people who've been executed, or major historic events. If you think of anyone from Socrates, who was executed in a way, the great philosopher, Christ, who was executed, and then in modern times we have many examples of people who have been executed. It's a punishment that's dying out. It's one of those things that was part of human history. It's a bit like slavery and the slave trade. It was something that was widely practiced and was lawful at a time, and that, I'm speaking of slavery now, slavery then became more and more illegal, although even 100 years ago, a little more than 100 years ago, it was still legal in some parts of the world, and it's now pretty much disappeared. So we can see that in terms of human progress, really, that an idea that something that was widely accepted, although there were always people who thought that slavery was inhumane and that people couldn't treat other human beings as property. But then there were many, fairly decent progressive people. I'm thinking of the American president, Thomas Jefferson, who actually owned slaves. They weren't bad people as such, but they were, nevertheless, they didn't see the moral unacceptability of slavery. Capital punishment's a bit like that. So it was practiced widely. I mean, here in London, they used to have huge numbers of executions, many of them for very petty crimes. People here in London were executed for pickpocketing, for example. We're talking a few hundred years ago. The executions were public. And what we see over the centuries is that the executions become, the crimes for which they're available become more and more limited. And more than 100 years ago in this country, it was essentially reserved for murder, death penalty, but there are other countries where it was retained for other types of crimes. The public executions disappeared, and they were done in private. The method of execution was, there were increasing efforts to make the execution less barbaric, more humane, less painful, less brutal. And in the last century or so, it reached a point where we start to see just countries getting rid of the death penalty. So we're now at a point where about 3/4 of the countries in the world, speaking very rough figures, don't have the death penalty anymore. There are a relatively small number of countries that use it. In any given year, of the 190 odd countries in the world, 20 countries will carry out an execution. And overall, over the last decade, for example, there are perhaps just less than 40 countries out of approximately 200 in the world. So that's 20%. Approximately 40 countries that have actually carried out executions. And even in the countries where the executions are still being carried out, I mean, some of the big ones are China, the People's Republic of China, and the United States, we see the numbers declining. So it's very clear, nobody really disputes this, that we have a worldwide global trend towards the abolition of capital punishment. And I think it's really just, it's like the prohibition of slavery, but 150 years. We're 150 years later. But, if we take the statistics, if we look at the numbers, about every year for the last 25 to 30 years, you have 2 to 3 countries who've abolished the death penalty. So if you look at those numbers now and you say, so how many more years will it take? You know, we're looking at 2027, 2028. In other words, you know, in our lifetimes, certainly, the lifetimes of most of the people watching this, they'll see, you know, the end of the death penalty in human history.
Now, I'd like to ask your opinion on capital punishment in terms of what you think, you know, is right or wrong, but we'll get to that in a minute. But what I want to know is, why capital punishment? Why was it something that intrigued you and interested you? And like you said, you've written many papers and books about it. What was it about that? Because, I mean, it is a very contentious subject, isn't it? Normally, you're on one side of the fence, we're on the other.
I suppose. You see, I was approaching it. I was a student. I was a doctoral student, and I was looking for a subject in the area of human rights law. I was a specialist in modern human rights, and I started working through the texts dealing with international human rights, looking for a good subject. Well, one of the first main articles in all of the big human rights conventions and treaties and declarations is the right to life. So I started looking at the right to life. And the right to life raises a bunch of interesting issues: euthanasia, abortion, killing in armed conflict, and of course the death penalty. And I started studying the whole thing, and I had too much stuff. I just ended up with, it happens to a student, I had boxes and boxes of photocopies. This was 25 years ago, so we photocopied everything and we made long, you know, paper notes. We didn't have PDFs and that sort of thing. And so I went through and I sort of said, well, I'm never going to finish this job if I keep trying to study the whole thing. And a friend of mine said, well, what do you have the most material on? And I said, I guess capital punishment. And she said, well, do your thesis on capital punishment. So that's how I did it. It's not a very exciting story. I think it was a subject. I don't want to make it sound too trivial, because it's a subject that I think always did interest me. I have memories from when I was a boy growing up in Canada in the 1960s of someone not much older than me. He'd been convicted of a rape and a murder, a 14-year-old. He was later proven to be innocent, by the way. It was a wrongful conviction. But he was a very celebrated case in the 1960s, and he was sentenced to death. A 14-year-old. I think I was 12 at the time, and I just remember just thinking about that and how horrible the idea was, how terrifying it was for a 12-year-old to think that someone a couple of years older than you could be sentenced to death. Now, the reason was he had been tried under Canadian law, and it's this case in most countries, that there's an area for adolescents where the courts can decide to try them as an adult. So he was tried as an adult, and you had the mandatory death penalty in Canadian law at the time, as you did in probably most countries of the British legal tradition, a mandatory death penalty for murder. So he was sentenced to death. Now, after the prime minister of the country commuted the sentence, so he was then changed to life imprisonment. But I remember that being very kind of chilled by that. And the other thing that I can recall from, again, as a boy, was I guess when I was in my early teens, I used to babysit for neighbors. And we had a neighbor who was a lawyer, and he was involved in the anti-death penalty movement. And I can remember one day babysitting for the children there. They were out, and someone came to the door and had brought a parcel, and it was documents, and it was very important because it was about an execution that they were trying to stop. So, you know, I have these early memories. When I practiced law, I also had clients who were touched by the death penalty. They were people who'd been sentenced at a time when Canada had the death penalty, after their sentence had been transformed into life imprisonment. But the legal remnants of the death penalty still influenced their parole applications. And so I acted for them in their applications for parole, and we had to deal with the death penalty. So, you know, I never defended a capital case, and by the time I practiced law, the death penalty was finished. But it was an area that was, you know, that touched me in a way. And I am convinced that people of my generation, for us, the death penalty is still something it's real. It's something that we lived with, even remotely. It was part of our upbringing. And I think that young people now, because I see lots of young people, I'm a university teacher, I see young people all the time. And I believe that for most of them in countries where the death penalty is long gone, like the United Kingdom or Ireland or Canada or many, many other countries, it's just so remote from their lives now, the idea of the death penalty. It's like a medieval, it's like one of those medieval punishments you read about, but they think it's something that belongs to the distant past. But for people of my age, it's not quite the distant past. You know?
So obviously your early childhood had a profound impact, and now you specialise. The fact that you've lived in so many countries around the world and you clearly go around and teach and talk about these kind of things, has that sort of kept it alive for you? Because for some of us who perhaps live in one country, maybe even two in a lifetime, I would expect that a lot of those are going to be westernised countries or countries where the death penalty isn't legal anymore. Certainly in my case, I was born in Australia, lived in England, and like you said, it's one of those sort of medieval things that in your mind, I have my own opinions on capital punishment and the death penalty, but none of them are personal.
Sure.
Like it.
Well, I was actually, although I grew up in Canada, I was born in the United States. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio, and they still have the death penalty in Ohio. So it's not so far away, actually. Although most of my life, of course, I've lived in countries where the death penalty is gone. I travel a great deal as part of my work, but also because I'm in international law. It's really a global discipline. And I guess I've visited about 100 countries now. And I often go to conferences and to lecture about capital punishment. I've also gone to countries to be an expert witness from time to time in a case where there's a challenge to the death penalty. And so I've testified occasionally before courts on this subject. Some years ago, I was invited to Brazil to a conference, and my wife, who gets a little fed up with all my travel, said to me, they don't really have the death penalty in Brazil, do they? And I said, no, not for a long time. And she said, well, why are you going there then? Why are you wasting your time going to a country where they don't have the death penalty to talk about it? And I said, yeah, that's a good point. I'll try not to do that again. Oh. So I mainly go to countries that that still have the death penalty to talk about it. I try to avoid doing just too much tourism. And so it's really a matter of trying to push the debate along. And, over the last decade, I've probably been to China 20, 25 times to conferences talking about the death penalty, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, Taiwan, and of course the United States, where there's an ongoing debate and where there are changes. And I think it is important not to divide the world into just the states that have abolished the death penalty and then the pariah states who still have it, because there's movement there that's very important, and in a way we get a greater sense of the direction, this trend towards abolition, by looking at the states that still have the death penalty, because we see how it's declining. I mean, it is, in the United States, you have about half the number of executions that you had just over a decade ago. You have juries in the United States who are involved in pronouncing the death penalty. It varies from state to state in the United States because the legal system it's a federal legal system, and so you have slightly different rules in the states that still have the death penalty in the U.S. But juries are almost always involved in the decision to execute in one form or another, and they just do it less. So it's a sign of public changes in public opinion about the death penalty that are quite intriguing. You have prosecutors who have to win the case, and they used to ask for it a lot more, and they ask for it less. So in many respects, you can see that you see a trend, but it's this is what's hard in studying the world and studying law. It's not just before and after, but it's identifying trends while things are underway. China, it's harder to measure, because the Chinese are still quite secretive about the death penalty. So the people I meet with there and talk to about capital punishment, senior academics, judges, lawyers, government officials, they all have been assuring me now for the last 4 or 5 years that there have been dramatic declines in the death penalty in China. And I believe them. They're people I trust. They have no reason to make up stories to me, and so I accept what they're saying, but they can't tell me how much the decline is, and the government won't. I think the Chinese government would like to be able to boast a little bit about the decline, but they can't do it without admitting how bad it was before. So we don't know in China. We can't measure it exactly, but I think there have been huge declines, certainly well over 50% in the last 5 to 10 years, a decline in the use of the death penalty. And then you have other countries where it's barely used at all. 1 or 2 executions every few years, and they're just undecided about whether to get rid of it. But you know, sooner or later it dawns on everybody that if you only execute someone once every 2 or 3 years, it can't have any logical purpose in criminal justice. It can't be a deterrent because there's no predictability of it being imposed, and it really just is. Usually, it's just an unlucky roll of the dice for the person who has a lousy lawyer, and the politics of it line up in such a way that they get executed. But there are many countries like that.
So, I mean, we could talk about this forever, but for the purpose of this interview, can you outline the debate surrounding capital punishment, for and against? What are the supporters and the ones that are against it? What are they saying? What are the main reasons?
Well, the argument that most people know and that we often hear expressed is the argument about deterrence. It's the idea that the death penalty will deter certain types of crime. And this is an argument that neither side actually can win, because it's very hard to prove a deterrent effect of a crime, of punishment. And the problem is because we can't measure the people who are deterred. All we see are the people who aren't deterred. Mm-hmm. And so it's very difficult to measure. I mean, we know about certain things that deter. Outside the studio, there on the road, there'll be a traffic camera. If I know there's a traffic camera there, I'm going to behave myself driving my car down the street. That deters. We know that. But we don't know about the level of punishment. And often people who are against the death penalty misstate the issue of deterrence, because they'll say things like, well, everybody knows the death penalty is not a deterrent, or nobody can prove the death penalty is a deterrent. And that's not really an accurate way to formulate it. The accurate way to formulate it is nobody can establish that the death penalty is a superior deterrent to a serious term of imprisonment. And I know the literature, I know all the studies that have been done. Nobody can prove that. And so then you're just left with a choice about the level of punishment. Do you really need to kill people to achieve that deterrent purpose? And the answer obviously is no. And there are good reasons not to do it. One is that we cherish the value of human life. Even people who've done the worst things they're still humans, and we have to respect their right to life. We have questions where there are mistakes that can be made. If you put somebody in prison and later they prove to be innocent, well, you can undo it, sort of. You can let them go, give them some compensation, and help them to rebuild their life. But you can't do that, obviously, if you've executed somebody. So this is the problem with the deterrent. I mean, I tell a story about this as an example. Some years ago, there was a case in the United States that probably some of the viewers may remember. They called it the Beltway Sniper. This was it was a man and an adolescent, a boy of, I think he was 17. The man was about 40. And they terrorized the city of Washington and their surrounding neighborhood for, I think, more than a year or more. They would drive around and park their car near a main motorway that goes around the city of Washington called the Beltway. Mm-hmm. And they would park their car, usually around the Beltway, and so they were called the Beltway Snipers. And one of them would get in the boot of the car, in the trunk of the car. They had a little hole hollowed out, and they would kill somebody at random. So it was terrible, and the city was terrorized. There was no explanation, and when they finally caught them, it was clear that they were just killing people at random. And now at the time, it was a terrible crime, and they were caught, and it stopped. But now at the time, Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, the capital district, didn't have the death penalty. It hasn't had the death penalty for a long, long time. The two surrounding states at the time had the death penalty. Virginia had the death penalty, including for juvenile offenders. And there was a juvenile involved. And Maryland had the death penalty, although it abolished it a year or so ago. But Maryland had the death penalty as well. So these guys were, all they had to do as they're driving along the Beltway was turn right, okay? Go into D.C., no death penalty. If they turn left, they were going to be in the death penalty state. And they committed almost all the murders in Virginia and Maryland. When I tell the story, people say to me, well, yeah, but those guys, they don't know about that. They don't think about that. And I say, yeah, that's the point. You know, murderers generally don't think about it. I think murderers think they'll get away with it. You know, so I mean, I think that's the case with murder. Most murderers either think they'll get away with it, or they don't care, because there's passion involved or something, and they don't care. But I don't think that we can, you know, find that that it's a deterrent. One of the great experts on the death penalty, Professor Roger Hood, says that the deterrence debate, he says, the only way we can know that the death penalty would be a superior deterrent to life imprisonment would be if we systematically executed everybody for a capital crime. But no country's going to do that.
No.
The United States, they have probably 2,000 or 3,000 people a year who are eligible for the death penalty, and they execute 50.
Why is that, though? How do they decide that?
Well, as I say, it's an unlucky, generally it's a bad roll of the dice for the person involved.
That's quite scary, though, isn't it? Is that not a really scary fact? It's just luck of the draw.
Well, it's scary, but it's not going to deter you, because if you look at it rationally, you'll say, you know, even if they catch me, what are the chances I'd be executed? Pretty slim. So, yeah, it's scary for the people who are there on death row who've been sentenced to death, but the fact is they're, and it's also, it's scary for people sometimes who come to court, because they, in the United States, you can often negotiate a plea bargain, and they'll say to the prosecutor, their lawyer will say, he'll plead guilty, but you have to withdraw the death penalty and give him life, and that way he'll save his life. And sometimes people are terrified at the possibility of death, and so they will plead guilty to a crime, sometimes to a crime that they didn't commit, because they're terrified at what would happen. So this is, you know, this is the deterrence argument, and in the United States, in the big debates about the death penalty, where it's probably at its most sophisticated, because there's been so much study and work on it and so many court cases, knowledgeable people don't argue about the deterrent effect anymore, because they know it's an argument neither side is going to win. And it's really just people who are, I don't want to, it'll sound a bit maybe patronizing to say naive, but people who don't know much about it. They just think intuitively that it's a deterrent. But, you know, it probably doesn't deter you from committing murder. You know, you don't commit a murder because you're a nice person, your parents raised you to be a decent human being. You know,
wouldn't think so. No.
You might think about committing a murder sometimes, but you would never actually do it. You know?
No.
Yeah.
No, I wouldn't.
So I mean, I think most of us, it's hard for us really to relate to the situation because we wouldn't do it anyway.
No.
And the reason why we're deterred from murdering people is because we respect our fellow human beings and we have good values. So it's very hard for us to put ourselves in that position.
It's definitely one of those subjects that I think it really divides people. You know, on the one hand, I can see the argument for. I mean, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with death penalty at all. But then when you hear some of these stories and these events that people do, you know, they say, you know, a life for a life. I mean, what's your opinion on that?
Well, okay, there you're into another notion about the death penalty, and that's another argument. That's not about deterrence, a life for a life.
No.
A life for a life is about you did it, you have to pay for it.
Yeah.
You have a debt to pay to society. And we would, broadly speaking, describe that as being the issue of retribution, that the death penalty is a retributive penalty. So it's not looking at it having any benefits for society. The deterrence is utilitarian. The deterrent argument is saying the death penalty will prevent crime. You know, making people pay a debt is not about preventing any crime at all. It's just saying, you know, you deserve the punishment. I have to say that's in a way a more compelling argument. It's a harder argument for someone who's against the death penalty to win, because ultimately it boils down to moral values people have. We can say that retribution, I mean, criminal justice is always about, when it works properly, not just the death penalty, but criminal justice generally, is about the state or the government providing a way of dealing with crime that disciplines us. Because if we left it to a victim if every time a crime was committed, we had a little referendum as to what punishment should be inflicted, we'd be a much more uncivilized society than we are today. So the state has to control that, and that's, because otherwise we'd be a kind of a society where a thief would be beaten to death in the marketplace for pickpocketing, which is what does happen in some parts of the world and used to happen here. But we view that as our becoming progressively more civilized as a society. So the state has to control that retributive urge somehow, and I think that's really the best argument against it. There's another argument that people come up with that you often hear, which is that we have to respect public opinion. The public opinion wants the death penalty, and that's sort of related to the retributive argument. They can do polls. There were some polls recently done. I mean, they do them in the UK, and they come back and say, if you ask people, do they want the death penalty, the majority of people will still say yes for special cases. Polling is a very inexact science, and there are many ways to measure public opinion. First of all, when you get the polls, you move them into a more sophisticated range where they ask more than just a blunt question, do you think, if someone a serial killer were to murder a bunch of children after raping them, would you be in favor of the death penalty? You're going to get more than 50%. Pretty sure. Even, here, in most countries, you're probably going to get over 50%. Yeah. If you say to people, in a case of somebody who committed a crime of passion or something like that, or murdered an aging relative whose quality of life had disappeared, should we have a mandatory death penalty? You'll get 3% will be for a mandatory death penalty. So you have to look for that middle ground. We know in the United States, we know in China that if you say to people, if we could reassure you that someone who commits a violent crime, murder, will be, if they're found guilty, will be kept in jail for the remainder of their life and won't ever be released. In other words, life imprisonment without a possibility of release. Would you consider that an acceptable substitute to the death penalty? And we'll get more than 50% who will say yes. The other place I think it's interesting to look at public opinion is if the public was really supportive of the death penalty in a country like the United Kingdom, you would think that you'd have a lot of politicians campaigning to reintroduce it. It would be an easy win for them. They know that they were pushing out an open door, that the public, the majority, liked it, so you'd see it as they'd be campaigning for it. Not one of our political parties, even the most conservative. I'm not talking about the Conservative Party, I'm talking about UKIP. They don't have the death penalty in their program. They probably have some MPs or some members who support it, but it's not in their program. In France, you have a very, very right-wing party called the Front National. They don't have it in their program. So, I think people, that's another way to look at it. You could say, if it was really, if it struck a chord in the public, you'd expect a lot more political activity. I don't know of a major newspaper in this country that has that as their editorial policy. No. So it is something that's, it's behind us. And with, as I said earlier, with, as the generation moves on, as my generation disappears, we're going to have 100% of the population who will have lived in an environment without the death penalty.
Removed, doesn't it,
absolutely,
from everyday life?
Absolutely.
I think the issue. I mean, I've said I'm against it, but when you hear the counter argument, and I've had this before. Obviously, I knew I was interviewing you, and I've spoken to people about it, and they said, but what if something happened to someone you loved? What if, God forbid, something tragic happened to someone you loved? Would you not? Now, I don't believe that it would give me any pleasure to see that person die. I don't personally see that, but then I guess there is an argument for that, isn't there?
Yeah, sure. It's a bit of a trick question, really. It's not the first time I've been asked it. As I told you, I've been working on the death penalty for 25 years, so I know these trick questions. Yeah. It was the question that they used to sabotage the Democratic candidate for the U.S. presidency in 1988, Michael Dukakis, and someone said, you're against the death penalty. His opponent was George Bush, the father of the the older George Bush. And I think he said in the debate, well, suppose it was your relative who had been, your wife had been raped and then murdered, would you be for the death penalty? And he said, no, it's a question of principle, I'm against the death penalty. And that finished him, because it suggested that he was unfeeling and insensitive and everything. So let me put it on the record, if somebody were to murder my children or my grandchildren, I'd want to rip them apart, gouge their eyeballs out and chop them in little pieces. Of course it is, absolutely. And, it's very, very important that in reforming criminal justice that we don't lose sight of the absolute compassion we have to feel for victims. But that being said, I added a few things that aren't allowed in law of any society, where I'd first like to gouge the guy's eyeballs out first and torture him, which again, these are, feelings of revenge. Yeah. There is natural human emotions as greed and jealousy and falling in love. I mean, we all feel them, but society can't do them. No. That's all.
What I find interesting, in a morbid kind of way, I guess, is so if someone is facing, execution in America, the lethal injection, sometimes the relatives of the victims get to watch. We see it I've only obviously ever seen it in a movie, and I literally can't even watch that part in the film. I have to close my eyes, because the thought of witnessing someone be brought to their death like that, I physically can't do it. But is there, in your experience and in your studies, does that provide any kind of justice for those people that you've spoken to? And have you witnessed it yourself?
No, I've never witnessed an execution, and I have no desire to do so. But I have many colleagues and friends who've done it. Often people who take these cases, the death row lawyers, their clients want them to go, and so they've been there for the execution. I admire them. I hope they don't have too much post-traumatic stress disorder from it. They're probably doing it as a way of showing solidarity with their client and making what's obviously a terrible, experience. I guess it's kind of hard to say no to somebody who asks you to do that if you've worked for them. And of course, families go, journalists go. They are kind of public in a way. It makes the execution probably more public than it should be. I don't think that was the case in the United Kingdom. I think in many countries, once they did away with these public hangings in the square where you'd have tens of thousands of people. I mean, here in London, they would go to Tyburn and you'd have an execution of a pickpocket. And they say that, this is about the deterrence argument, in the crowd, the pickpockets would be working the crowd while they were executing someone for being a pickpocket. That's, that's the time of Charles Dickens, that sort of thing, 200 years ago. But there is a public aspect of it which I think people find very distasteful. The public execution that everybody's seen, or many people have seen because it was on YouTube not all that long ago, was the execution of Saddam Hussein. And it wasn't meant to be public, but there were people there with their iPhones. I don't know if we had the iPhone then, but with their mobile phones, with their cameras, and they took pictures of it and they posted it on the internet. And at the time, I remember having Arab students who were probably not, probably not committed to the abolition of the death penalty, and particularly for a brutal dictator like Saddam Hussein. And I remember how upset they were. They found it a very distasteful business, the public execution. Does it do things for the victims? I don't know. One of the executions that I didn't see, but that I met a lot of people who had seen, and probably the most public execution in recent years was in Rwanda in 1998. In April of 1998, in Rwanda, they executed, I think, 22 people for the crime of genocide. These were people who'd been convicted of being perpetrators of genocide in 1994. One of them, I'd attended his trial because I was a trial observer for Amnesty International in 1997. So they did this in football stadiums around Rwanda. And I met an American diplomat who attended, and I met many people who'd been victims themselves of genocide, not of those individuals directly, and they went to the stadiums and watched the execution. And I asked them after. I said, "So, Did it do it for you? You know, what did it do for you? Did you get some satisfaction, some closure? And they all said no. I didn't meet one person.
Really?
Maybe there are some, but I didn't meet one who said to me, yeah, I had a sense of justice. People were frustrated by it. They thought it was an ugly spectacle, and it didn't deliver what it was supposed to. Those were, by the way, the first executions Rwanda had conducted in 15 years, and they're the last. Rwanda had one day in April of 1998 when it had these executions, and then it stopped. And I think it was partly because they realized that the logic of it was that they would have to execute tens of thousands of people, and they realized that that was just unthinkable. So how do you then decide the handful of people who you're going to execute for this terrible crime of genocide? And so they stopped, and then about 8 or 9 years ago, they abolished the death penalty entirely. So Rwanda has gone from being a country that carried out very, very ugly public executions to a country that's now in the abolitionist camp. I should say, by the way, you didn't ask me this, but can I volunteer a little bit of information about the geography of the death penalty? People might be interested in that. Europe, everybody knows, is virtually a death penalty-free zone. Okay?
Virtually.
Virtually. We have one country in Europe, Belarus, where they still have executions. They have about 2 or 3, 4 a year.
Okay.
So it's not very significant in terms of numbers. It's like it's like a blemish on your face or something. It's there. But Europe basically is free of the death penalty. And I think aside from Belarus, the last executions in Europe were at the end of the 1990s. I think Latvia had an execution in 1999, and then if you go back, you had the last in Western Europe were in France, not that long ago, in the late 1970s. They had executions, and you know how they do it there with the guillotine, chopping the heads off. And I know a man who was a lawyer who attended executions by the guillotine because he had clients who'd been sentenced to death. The Western Hemisphere, the Americas, is virtually free of the death penalty except for one notorious case, which everybody knows, the United States. There, the death penalty is really confined to a small number of states in the South. They were, and people have made the point, they were the slave states. Mm-hmm. They were the states where after the end of slavery you had widespread and accepted by the authorities lynching of blacks who were charged with crimes. So they're countries that have always, they're parts of the United States that have always had a fairly brutal tradition, and that continues to an extent, although, as I say, it's declining there as well. The Spanish-speaking countries, Spanish and Portuguese countries and French-speaking, Haiti, I should add, death penalty is finished. Many of them go back many, many decades. And Canada stopped, it abolished the death penalty about 40 years ago. The Caribbean, you have some states in the Caribbean, Commonwealth countries, where people are still being sentenced to death, but it's virtually disappeared in the Caribbean as well. I think in the last decade there's been one execution in the entire Caribbean. So, but if you ask the people there, if you ask the Minister of Justice or the Attorney General in a country like Barbados or Trinidad and Tobago or Jamaica, they'll say, oh, no, we haven't stopped, but they have.
And do you think that's a fear thing?
I think that they have just I mean, as I say, they haven't abandoned it, but they've stopped using it. I think that, and the longer they go without using it, the harder it is to reinstate it.
And do you think that in any of those cases there's the fear of international pressure?
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course there is. Yeah. And they're realizing more and more, of course, as the number of states that have the death penalty, as the trend becomes more and more apparent, that they're setting themselves out to be a bit of an international pariah state if they do go back to executions. And I think that weighs more and more heavily on states who are thinking, why do we really need this? Can we do without it? It doesn't do any good for our criminal justice system, and it puts us on the wrong side of history, on the wrong side of the fence. The continent that is probably the most surprising, and people are probably not so well informed about, is Africa, where the death penalty has largely disappeared, and it's gone from being widespread, was used in virtually all of Africa not very long ago, and now it's really just a small number of countries in northeast Africa, Arab and Islamic countries, Egypt, Somalia, Sudan.
They still have it.
They have it. Libya has it. They haven't executed anybody since the beginning of the Arab Spring, but I'm not sure they've got it out of their system yet. And that's something that we see also in a lot of countries where there are great political transformations. Countries will abolish the death penalty as a symbolic way of breaking with the past, of showing that they've put an old, an autocratic, brutal regime behind them. So that's what South Africa did. It's what many of the countries in Central and Eastern Europe did with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the political changes that took place in the early 90s. And so that leaves Asia, where you have some countries that have abolished the death penalty, some that hardly use it or don't use it at all, or where there appears to be a moratorium. So it's South Asia, Sri Lanka, Myanmar or Burma, Nepal don't have the death penalty, really. Sri Lanka still has it on the books, but they don't impose it. The same with Myanmar. Nepal has abolished it. India executes one person about every 5 years, and Pakistan has had a moratorium on the death penalty for some time now. So all of these countries are actually very clearly, there's not much going on in the capital punishment business in South Asia right now.
It's probably a bit of an unusual question to ask you, but perhaps not. But what methods are deployed in these countries for the death penalty? Is it different depending on what one's widely used? Obviously, United States use the lethal injection mostly.
Yes, and there's been
always?
No. There's been a lot of change on the methods of execution over time. So we have a range of methods. The lethal injection has taken hold in the United States over the last 40 or 50 years, and it's not the only method. There are a couple of states that still may have the electric chair. And I think there's one where they've had problems with the lethal injection because they can't get the drugs, and so they're talking about.
There was a recent case of that, wasn't there?
Yeah, so they say they're going to pull the electric chair out of the warehouse and and get it hooked up again. But the electric chair was introduced in the United States 120 years ago as a humane method of execution. The idea was that it would be more humane than hanging people. And the U.S. introduced, and more certain. It was felt it would be more certain, and perhaps not as brutal to watch, although it can be. Oh no, sometimes people catch fire when they're being executed on an electric chair.
I literally can't even watch it on the films. It makes me feel sick.
Well, yeah. Although I get sick looking at the lethal injection because the medical nature of it, the clinical nature of it, is a hospital, needles, drugs. They should be for healing people, and there's something very perverse about it being used to kill people. But the hanging, in the UK in the early 50s, they looked at these various methods: electric chair, gas chamber, and the lethal injection was already starting, and they had a royal commission here in the UK in the early 50s, and they said no, hanging was the best. We'd stick with hanging, but they only had a few more hangings. It was on its way out. But you would have hanging is used in Iran publicly. Iran is a big death penalty state.
Is it?
Yeah, and we don't see any of the trends to the decline in the death penalty in Iran.
Oh, really?
It's one of the worst.
Why do you think that is?
It has a very brutal, repressive government, and they use it to terrorize the population. It sends a message. It sends a message that democracies don't need to send, which is that, if you cross the state, if you go against us, if you organize opposition, you could lose your life. And that's, I think, what they're trying to do. That being said, most of the executions in Iran are for drug trafficking. many hundreds of years. So Iran was right at the top.
Above China.
If we do it by population, if we do it by the percentage of executions, Iran is right at the top. Iran and Saudi Arabia are the worst countries in the world.
I know you've mentioned that it's hard to measure in China as well because they don't give the figures, but is there any evidence at all that suggests that in these countries where death penalty is quite profound, that there is more civil rest, or there's less crime, or there's more control? I'm not saying that's a good thing, but is there any evidence to suggest that at all?
I don't think so. I mean, people have looked at countries when they abolished the death penalty and they say, look at how, they'll say they abolished the death penalty and the murder rate didn't go up, it went down. Yeah, but maybe it was going down anyway. It's those types of, I don't think those things provide much. I don't think they're very helpful in indicating it. But if we're looking at civil, unrest, political unrest, I think it's just that you have people in power who think that the way you keep control is to brutalize your population, and so the death penalty comes as sort of part of the package. So I think that's mainly why they hang on to it in Iran. They also use a religious argument. Some of the Islamic states will say, oh, but we have to have the death penalty because it's in Islamic law, it's in the Sharia law. Well, yes and no. I mean, it's in the Sharia law for blasphemy, as a mandatory punishment for blasphemy, apostasy, that is changing one's religion, and adultery. But none of these states they're not going to execute everybody who commits adultery or everybody who blasphemes. So that's the mandatory death penalty in Sharia law. And so, but they use that argument. They say, well, you see, it's mandatory under Sharia law. Yeah, but it's not mandatory for trafficking in cocaine or in marijuana or heroin, which is what most of the people in Iran are getting the death penalty for. Drugs is a case where we know that it's not the death penalty that stops the drug trade. It's better enforcement. It's more predictable. If a drug trafficker thinks they're going to get away with it, the rewards are so great that they're going to run the risk. They don't care about the penalty. It doesn't deter them. They're afraid of getting caught because they know if they get caught, they're going to get a serious penalty one way or another. Better enforcement. Iran is actually not bad at enforcement. They do better than many countries in the region, which shows that they don't need the death penalty actually at all.
We've opened up this interview for some questions for people to get involved, and Max Mustermang wants to know if your opinion, or if you know, if there's a US state that has less murder rates than in some European countries.
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it depends what you mean by Europe, because if we take the Council of Europe, it includes Russia, and it includes other countries formerly in the Soviet Union, and I suspect that the murder rates are quite high there. I think there are probably murder rates there that are higher than certainly in some states in the United States, but the United States has high rates of violent crime. It also has very high rates of in terms of criminal justice, not so much the death penalty, but of detention. I mean, they have more than 2 million people in the United States are in jail at any given time. Well, that's way off the charts compared to what we have in Europe. But I mean, we know the United States we just have to read the newspapers and see these mass killings and serial killers and guns, and it's a pretty violent part of the world.
It's one of those. It's just a baffling subject, isn't it? Really. We've had another question that comes in, and they want to know how much the US spends on capital punishment per year.
Oh, I don't think I know the answer to that. It's a costly business conducting the death penalty, and often it's really this issue arises when people make the argument. They say, well, why don't we execute this terrible person? I mean, sometimes, I talked about wrongful convictions, but sometimes the guy did it.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have DNA evidence, maybe they confess, whatever. It's clear they committed a terrible crime, and people say, well, why should we keep them alive? Why should we, provide them with...
It costs to put them in prison, obviously,
exactly.
Especially lifetime.
Exactly. And they say so it'd be cheaper to execute. But in the United States, in a country where you allow all the legal remedies to challenge the execution, there have been studies that show that it's actually more expensive.
Oh, really?
To go because of the additional legal hurdles they have to go through in terms of appeals and everything. That actually costs more. It's a nightmare for a lot of American jurisdictions. Some little township or county or whatever the unit is that's responsible for the prosecution, and they get a murder and they want to do the death penalty, and then they say it's just going to cost them a fortune because they're going to have to jump through all the hoops, the legal hoops. So, but I don't know what the actual cost is.
I guess one of perhaps an issue or debate could be said is that some people feel that prison is an easy way out, or it's there's some prisons, I don't know, having never been to one, never want to go to one, that it's a comfy life, they get some privileges and they've got a gym and they don't have to pay, it's all provided for them, and hey, you committed a crime but you've got a roof over your head now for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I don't think much of that argument. I've been in prisons myself. I've never been sentenced to prison.
To make that point clear.
But as a criminal lawyer, I used to go sometimes to visit clients, and recently I went to see someone who was in the detention unit of the International Tribunal in The Hague, and I saw that, and it's clean and tidy, and everything. But you can't go out for a walk. You're deprived of your liberty, even in the best of prisons. I visited African prisons, which are much more primitive in a sense in terms of the surroundings. They have latrine pit toilets and things like this, although they're actually more congenial environments, I think, than some of the prisons you see here, because the problem with a lot of prisons in Western countries is that they're a place of people who are a lot of very disturbed people. There are lots of, I've been mainly in prisons with men, and you just see these big, pumped up guys who've been doing too much weightlifting with tattoos everywhere, and they're kind of, it's a very, perverse environment as well. I wouldn't exaggerate that. I think everybody's glad to get out of prison who's in prison, and I think the people who are there are pretty miserable, So I don't.
No, okay. We've had another question come in, and they want to know whether you think there are any merits at all for capital punishment.
Well, I mentioned some of the arguments that I said are difficult to get around, but to go back to my original point, it's like asking me if there are any merits to slavery. Probably you could make a case. Slavery, it saves on.
In your opinion?
Yeah, ultimately, people are against the death penalty for a range of reasons. And some people, for example, we raise the issue of cost. Some people say, no, we shouldn't have it, it costs too much. Some people are against it for religious reasons. Some people are against it for reasons where they're concerned about wrongful convictions. My own personal view, I've thought about it a lot. What's the best reason? What's the reason that motivates me? And I think it ultimately boils down to our own view of ourselves as human beings and of human dignity. And I don't mean so much the dignity of the person who is going to be executed. Sometimes they're pretty miserable, unfortunate people, and they've done brutal, terrible things. I don't want to suggest that there's anything. And, some people in this who are against the death penalty get a little caught up in, they romanticize a little bit the prisoners. I'm not a person to do that. But it's also about our dignity as a society, yours and mine, and we have a dignity ourselves about how we relate to each other and how we view the world, and I think it means that it would be undignified for us to kill someone. The same way, I'm not quite a vegetarian, but but I think that we treat animals with dignity as well. And we should treat our environment with dignity. So I'm a big believer in that, and I think a lot of it is simply that it's, as an advanced modern society with values that we respect and that we try to promote, that there are some things we can't do to other human beings because it's undignified for us as much as it is for them. But that's a personal view.
Do you think that the death penalty is a signal for human failure?
No, it's something that, started as a primitive form of punishment in the earliest days. And criminal justice and punishment is a sign of success, because it means we moved out of the jungle, and we're starting to regulate our conduct as human beings, and we do it in, it's a work in progress. That's something that has to get gradually more sophisticated, more professional, more humane, and something that's in keeping with our evolving values. So I just see it as it's a stage in history that has to be. It doesn't mean, it's like slavery too. It doesn't mean that the people 1,000 years ago who did these practices were profoundly immoral people or anything. They were creatures of their time, and it was a feature of human development. Other features of punishment too. I mean, we know it's still the case today, that investigators, the police, when they investigate crimes, in the old days, they just pull in the usual suspects and beat them up until they confessed. It sort of works. It's not the best way to do an investigation. You get a lot of people who will confess to anything because they've been tortured or beaten up in prison. But it's better than just lining everybody up and taking every 10th person and saying, well, you're going to murder them because somebody got murdered in the country. It represents a form of, of progress in the sense that you're attempting to find a more scientific, logical way of distinguishing those who committed the crime from those who didn't. And so all of these things, today we say, no, you can't torture people. And, we have other methods. We have, DNA, we have laboratories, we have cameras, we have other ways of catching criminals, and it's better. And we like that, and it's the world we want to live in, and it will get better still. I just see the death penalty, it's a phase in human history that I find it exciting to be living at a time when we're actually outgrowing it. We're seeing this time when it is, I do believe, in the next 15 or 20 years, it's going to virtually disappear.
That brings me on to my next question, actually, and you've kind of answered it really, but do you think that humanity has actually moved on really at all, as in those primate instincts, life for a life, eye for an eye? Have we really moved on from that?
Oh yes, obviously we have.
But have we?
Yeah, well, I'm more generally, I'm talking here about the death penalty, but I'm more generally someone who works in the field of international human rights. And people ask this question, are we doing better in terms of human rights generally, or worse? I generally think we're doing better. But it's hard to measure in some areas, It's harder to measure. Is there more torture today or less torture than there was 50 years ago? Probably less, but I can't measure that. If we talk about equality, is there less racial discrimination today than there was 50 years ago? I think there probably is. We don't have states like South Africa, for example, that are officially racist in the way that we did 50 years ago. Is there more women's equality? 50 years ago, I'd be interviewed by a man. Okay? There are certainly, my students at university, my law students, the majority throughout my career have been women. But that wasn't the case 50 years ago. So there are ways you can measure it, but it's not always so straightforward to measure that progress. With the death penalty, it just provides us, it's so mathematical in a way. You can crunch the numbers and you can see this progress. So I think it's quite an encouraging approach. But the problem, when I say this in the human rights field, people think they don't like the message in a way because they think it's going to demobilize people, it's going to discourage people. So, if I go to the Amnesty International conference and say, we're doing great, we're making such progress, things are so much better, well, the checkbooks go back in people's pockets and they don't give us much money. And so
fair enough.
It's part of our stock in trade as people involved in the human rights movement to kind of give this glum, depressing message, but actually, I think there's just too much evidence to show that these improvements in some areas. Not to say that there aren't still terrible problems, and one of them that people say, well, yeah, okay, so we stopped the judicial executions, but we still have summary executions that are being carried out in various parts of the world. Not here in the United Kingdom, but in some parts of the world. And that's true, but it's a separate problem. That's more like torture. That's a crime that is, it's a crime everywhere. Even in countries where it seems to be widely practiced, they have a law against murdering people. So it's a different kind of a problem. You know, the problem of the death penalty is it's legal. It's legal in the countries that do it. And so abolishing it, it's like when slavery was legal in this country or in other parts of the world. And so abolishing it is a really measurable progress, very important.
Max has got back in touch. He clearly has lots of opinions and views on this subject, and he wants to know whether whether people that are on capital punishment facing the death penalty, whether they have a higher suicide rate.
Well, you know, it's not straightforward to commit suicide in a prison because they monitor you and they put you on suicide watches and so on. But yes, I think they do. I think they do. Absolutely. You know, people have studied this as well, but there's a whole phenomenon of people who are on death row who've been sentenced to death go through various kinds of transformations psychologically. I mean, some of them are convinced of their innocence, and occasionally they're able to establish it and prove it, and they're released. There are, in the United States, hundreds of people. Some of them I've met. Some I used to know a couple in the west of Ireland when I lived in Ireland, and she had been sentenced to death in Florida and then was ultimately released and after demonstrating her innocence. And other people have done this. So these are tough, you know, courageous people who manage to keep their heads screwed on while they're in prison. Other people, I mean, some people are wrongfully convicted, and they go to jail, and they don't keep their heads screwed on properly. It just destroys them as individuals. And then you have other people who are, you know, really quite, you know, mentally very unstable at the time they're committed, and they may get worse. So absolutely, there's a, you know, if you measure the mental health of people when they go on to death row and then check them 10 years later, I think on average the score would be lower than it was when they went in. There's no doubt about that.
When you spoke to people that had been on death row and then were found to be innocent, was there any kind of general thing that they all said? Was there anything that were their opinions on it particularly strong in one way or another?
Well, I think a lot of them have a sense of, there's a sense of anger that they had, you know, many years of their lives were taken from them. This is not something that only people on death row experience, because we have wrongful convictions in other areas. Although the ones I've met, I haven't made a specialty of meeting people, but in that situation. But I've met some of them, and they don't strike me as being bitter or angry people. Maybe I just haven't seen that side of their character. Maybe they had their temper tantrums and then they got over it and moved on. But they seem to be, you know, they're moving on with their lives. Their lives are better than they were when they were in prison, and they've beaten that threat of the death penalty. And so, in a way, I guess they're going about their lives then with. They're kind of blessed in a way, because they've been given a life that they thought was going to be taken from them. You know, as for how they behave in prison, I mean, you could say, you mentioned the word courage, but they don't really have any choice. You know, courage usually involves a choice. And, you know,
courage to keep going.
Yeah. But to do that, and I think in all prisons there are people, some who keep going and recover. That's what it's supposed to be for. That's really the purpose of prison, and it's supposed to do that for everybody. It generally doesn't do it very well, but you know, the human soul triumphs even in that adverse environment.
Is it not ironic that people that generally get sentenced to death is because they have killed someone? So they've killed someone, or they've done a horrific crime, and they get sentenced to death for it. That's their punishment. But then the punishment is because they did exactly that.
Well,
it's quite ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the country. And as I said, in Iran, most of the people sentenced to death are there for drug trafficking, not just for murder.
I mean, I'm thinking more.
But the murder, absolutely, and of course the murder. When you sentence people for murder, then you're right in the heart of that argument of a life for a life. It's that idea as well. Amnesty International 25 years ago published a very famous book on the subject, and they called it When the State Kills. So they were making the point that the state is doing the same thing that they're punishing someone for, is taking away a life.
Do you find that people, when you're out for dinner or you're socialising, do you find that people want to challenge you on it? They want to kind of come up with something that perhaps you haven't thought about before? Because I think people genuinely do have their opinions on it, and they do want to voice them, or at least, I've had this debate with many people before, and they want to challenge you on it.
They do, it's one of those issues too that if you want to have an argument. These days, it's very hard to have a quarrel over dinner with anybody because someone pulls out their phone and finds the answer.
Yeah.
So
there is no answer to this.
There is no answer.
No.
So it's a great subject. It's the kind of subject that people teaching languages like to give to their students to talk, because it gets them to talk. It's something that people will talk about. And sure, it raises moral issues, it raises philosophical issues, and of course it's something that's real in some parts of the world. So it's a definite, it's something that people do sometimes like to talk about. It happens to me from time to time, although that's just part of being a specialist in the subject.
What if you could say one thing to someone to sum up your argument against the death penalty? What would it be? What would your closing argument be?
Well, my argument would be that my argument is that I don't really need to worry too much about people's opinions on the death penalty, because it is going to disappear. So I don't need to argue about the reasons why it should disappear. It has disappeared in this country, so we can discuss it, but I don't really need to convince anybody, because I know it's disappeared and I don't think it'll ever come back. And that's the case in most countries in the world. The trend is so clear that the death penalty, so I tell people, I don't want to argue with you about the death penalty, because it's going to disappear anyway. No matter how hard we argue, it's going. It's going the way the slave trade disappeared, the way other obnoxious features of human society in the past have disappeared, and it's going to disappear soon. So it's not an argument really, but it's an answer to the question. I just say I don't need to argue with you, because it's going to disappear anyway.
What's your opinion on the recent airstrikes in Gaza? Has war crimes been committed there?
Oh, no, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to speak about that. I was recently appointed by the United Nations to chair a commission of inquiry about Gaza, and I'm being steadfastly neutral and impartial. I don't talk about it. You'll read my report and that of my colleagues when it comes out in 6 months.
That comes out in 6 months?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's a whole other interview. Maybe we'll get you back on.
Not before 6 months.
Not before 6 months. Next year.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor. It was an absolute pleasure.
Thank you.
And of course, if you want to rewatch this interview, then it's going to be downloaded on our website very shortly. And of course, we have so many more of these types of interviews in the series. So continue to check the channel out. Thank you very much. See you soon.